Okay, good evening, welcome. We have a long unit to do today, so we'll see. In terms of the schedule, we only need to do Unit 5 this week, but I would actually like to finish Unit 5 tonight, and then do Unit 7 with you on Thursday evening. Just so that we can leave enough time for Unit 8, because Unit 8 is quite complicated. You will see in the course schedule that I've made a note there that Unit 6 is omitted. We do not do Unit 6. Okay, so let's get started immediately. Let me share the slides. Remember the slides and everything, and the links to the recordings. I still need to share the link to the previous week's recording, although I have already uploaded it on e-learning, on YouTube. But the links to the recordings, the slides, the study material, everything is on e-learning. You should frequent the e-learning platform regularly. Okay, just give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides. Okay, I've shared my screen. Can you see the slides? Okay, Mr. Petrus can see them. Everybody else? Okay, wonderful. Okay, so just remember, on a point of order, while I'm teaching, I'm focusing on my slides, which is in a different window. So I can't see the class, so I can't see you if you raise your hand. If you want to interrupt me, if you have a question, please speak up, and I'll give you an opportunity. Alternatively, please use the chat box. Okay, so let's just get back to what we've done so far. We have looked at the constitution of a company, how a company, which documents a company's constitution consists of. And then in the last lecture, we looked at the different type of companies. We saw there are two main types of companies: a company with a share capital and a company without a share capital. And then with companies with a share capital, we get private companies and public companies. And under private companies, a specific type of private company, namely a Section 60B company. So we were talking about companies with a share capital. So today we're zooming in on this concept, a company with a share capital. What am I talking about? What is a share capital? What does the term capital mean? So when we looked at the types of companies, we started looking at companies with a share capital, we learned that shareholders become part of this company by buying shares. Way back in the beginning of companies, remember, companies as a business form have existed for about 200 years. When Sydney had a good business idea and he wanted to start his business, it takes money to make money. So Sydney has a good business idea, but he doesn't have enough money to get the business started. So he registers a company and he sells his idea, so to speak, to Vincent and Sean and Simaneka and whoever else. They think it's a good business idea. They invest in this idea by buying shares in the company. Please keep your mics muted. So if you look at the notes, it starts off with some basic terminology. That's just for background. You don't need to stress about that. We're going to go straight into types of shares. Let me go to my slides. So there's your learning objectives. Remember always to refer back to your learning objectives. I'm going to skip the basic concepts. You can read through that yourself. This is just terminology that you will come across when you are dealing with companies in the accounting profession. So, types of shares. First of all, we get two types of shares. You get par value shares, and then you get no par value shares, abbreviated as PV shares and NPV shares. These are the two types of shares that you get. In South Africa, incidentally, you no longer have no par value shares. You only have par value shares. So the par value, also known as the nominal value, that is a share that has a value attached to it. But this value, now just you've got to understand this. This par value is literally just a random thumbsuck value, which is allocated to the shares in the constitution of the company. It is an indication of the minimum amount to be received by the company when these shares are first issued. So when the company sells them for the first time. The par value, however, does not have any relation to its true value, the market value. The market value, that is what people are prepared to sell for, to pay for these shares. The par value, merely an indication of the minimum amount. So if the par value, in many instances, the par value of shares is indicated as being $1, but on the market, in the open market, they trade for hundreds of dollars. Par value, just an indication of the minimum amount to be received by the company upon issue, but they can sell them for more than that. Companies can choose what type of shares to issue. But all their ordinary shares or all their preference shares must be either par value or no par value. They can have ordinary shares. You're going to explain shortly what ordinary and preference shares mean. You can have ordinary shares that are par value and preference shares that are no par value. But all the ordinary shares, you can't mix the types of shares in ordinary shares or in preference shares. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. So when a company is registered, one of the items, content that is included in the memorandum. Remember what the memorandum is. That's the founding document that contains certain important information. The information regarding the authorized share capital is stated in the memorandum of a company. Authorized share capital, also known as the registered share capital or the nominal share capital. If a company wants to change this, they can do so by following the required process of amending the memorandum of association. The authorized share capital holds no real connection to the amount of money that the company needs to start to run the business. It is merely an indication of the maximum capital that the company intends to raise. So the authorized share capital, I must stop doing this, sorry. The authorized share capital, that is the maximum amount of shares that may be sold by the company. It is contained in the memorandum. The actual amount of those shares that have been issued, you will find in the financials of the company, in the balance sheet. So remember, distinguish between authorized share capital, the maximum that they may issue, and the issued share capital, that amount which has actually been issued. Your issued share capital can be less than the authorized share capital, but it cannot be more than the issued share capital. Company may not issue shares for free, can only issue shares if the full issue price has been paid, has been received by the company. Full issue price, we're talking of money here. You have to pay for shares. You cannot work for the shares or work and receive shares as remuneration. So that was types of shares. We also get classes of shares. There are only two types of shares: par value and non-par value. Company can, however, issue any number of classes of shares. How do we distinguish between classes of shares? Every class of shares has got different rights. These rights can vary: rights regarding voting, rights regarding dividends, rights regarding participation in distribution, about liquidation, etc., etc. So think of every class of shares as a bunch of flowers. Different flowers in the bunch, different rights. So there's a bunch of mixed flowers with different rights. Then there's a bunch of yellow flowers that has different rights, and a bunch of purple flowers that has different rights. Try to picture it like that. Now, I've said a company can have any number of classes of shares. Our law recognizes three main classes, namely preference shares, ordinary shares, and deferred shares. Company can issue any number of classes, but if they decide to issue just one class of shares, these have to be ordinary shares that all have equal voting rights and that are entitled to share in the surplus if the company is liquidated. What that means, if the company comes to an end, assets are sold, debts are paid, whatever remains is then divided amongst the shareholders. So you can vary these rights. You can have a class of shares that will not eventually share in the surplus, in the free residue. But if a company issues only one class of shares, these must be ordinary shares with equal voting rights. So all the holders of that particular class of shares, their voting rights are calculated on the same basis, and they are able to share in the surplus when the company is liquidated. Please keep your mics muted. Okay, before I carry on with with preference shares, any questions so far?
No questions from my side.
Thank you, Alicia. So, preference shares. The word preference should remind you of to prefer. They are preferred shares, preferential shares, preference shares. Why are they preferential? If you prefer something, it means it stands first in the queue. Why are these shares known as preference shares? Because they stand first in the queue when it comes to the payment of dividends. Dividends, that is profit sharing. It's the way in which a company shares profits by paying dividends. Now, a company can issue numerous classes of shares, but it cannot issue preference shares if it does not also have ordinary shares. Let's go back. If a company issues only one class of shares, these must be ordinary shares. So a company can never, ever, ever have only preference shares. That makes sense if you think about it, because preference shares stand first in the queue when it comes to receiving dividends. But you cannot be first in the queue if there isn't somebody that is behind you. So one person doesn't make a queue. There must be at least two people in the queue. There must be at least ordinary shares so that the preferential shareholders can stand in front of them. Now, it sounds wonderful to find out that if you are a preferential shareholder, you stand first in the queue to get your dividends. But there's a flip side to the coin. Otherwise, everybody would want to buy preferential shares and nobody would be interested in getting ordinary shares. So the drawback to preferential shares is that, in general, they do not have voting rights. They cannot vote at meetings of shareholders. And voting, as we will learn in Unit 8, is an important manner in which shareholders exercise control over a company Voting is how shareholders make decisions and make sure that they're happy with how the company is being run. If you are merely a preferential shareholder, you stand first in the queue to get dividends, but you have no say in the control, the management of the company because you cannot vote. As I stressed, generally, they have no voting rights. Whenever I use the word generally, you should immediately realize that there are exceptions. Otherwise, I would just have said no voting rights. I said generally, so they have voting right. There are exceptions. Firstly, first exception to the no voting rights rule is if their dividends remain in arrears and unpaid. I will get back to that. Secondly, if the resolution being voted about directly affects their rights or interests, including a resolution for the winding up of the company. So if they decide to close down the company, they will have a right to vote, or alternatively, if this decision is directly going to affect their rights. I'm going to get back to both these exceptions in due course this evening still, where I will explain more about them. Now, first of all, talking about preference dividend or any redemption payment remains in arrears and unpaid. This is relevant to a particular class of preference shares, which is referred to as cumulative preference shares. Cumulative comes from the word accumulate. Now, generally, how it works in a company is if the company has not made a profit that particular year, or the directors decide that they have made a profit, but they would rather retain the profit to expand the business, so they're not going to be paying dividends. Incidentally, there's no law saying a company must pay dividends every year. That is a decision to be made by the directors, not by the shareholders, by the directors. The directors decide whether they are going to declare and pay dividends in a particular year. Now, normally for ordinary shares, if a company has decided, the directors have decided not to declare dividends in a particular year, then you just didn't get any profit sharing. You didn't make any money on your investment that year. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't demand dividends. Cumulative preference shares, however, one of the rights that they have, which forms part and parcel of this bouquet of rights that it has, is the rights to a certain amount or percentage dividends annually. So you buy these preference shares because you are, in fact, guaranteed to make money every year. This guarantee, however, does not overrule the director's right to declare dividends or not to declare dividends. With ordinary shares, if the company hasn't declared dividends, it falls away. You didn't get everything. With cumulative preference shares, the unpaid dividends accumulate They add up, they build up. If in 2023 you did not receive anything, that right doesn't lapse, you still have it. So if in 2024 dividends are declared, you get back pay. Dividends in respect of preference shares must first be paid in respect of each financial year that these were not paid. So they add up, they accumulate. Your unpaid dividends don't lapse, but you don't have the right to claim them. You can't take the company to court and say they must be paid now. Still remains the director's right to declare them. Dividends must first be declared. Once they have been declared, however, you have an enforceable claim for the actual cash. While your dividends are in arrears, so if for a certain year you didn't get anything, you have voting rights. The moment everything has been paid up, you don't have voting rights. How are we going to know whether preference shares are cumulative? It will be stated in the conditions of issue. If nothing is stated, there's a presumption in favor of cumulativeness. So we presume that preference shares are cumulative. If they are not going to be cumulative, in other words, the dividends will lapse every year, that must be expressly stated in the conditions of issue. Then we get another possible class of preference shares, which is known as redeemable preference shares. Redeemable preference shares can be cumulative. They're not mutually exclusive. So most instances you have your redeemable preference shares will be cumulative. What does to redeem mean? To redeem means to buy back. But I'm warning you now, because in a later unit this will become relevant. When you are referring to redeemable preference shares, don't use the word buyback, because there's another section in the Companies Act which refers to buying back of the shares. When we get to them, you're going to be expected to distinguish between redeeming preference shares and buying back preference shares. Redeemable preference shares, you cannot decide yourself that you have now been a shareholder long enough and you want your money back. They are redeemed strictly at a time and in the manner prescribed by the articles and the conditions of issue. So when you buy them, it will be stated that they will be redeemed in 24 months' time or whatever. They can't be redeemed at random. This choice is not up to the shareholder to decide to redeem them. It's a company decision. But if the company decides to redeem their preference shares, the company will pay you for them. In most instances, practically always, these redeemable preference shares are redeemed at a profit. So if you pay $100 for your shares, when it's redeemed, the company will pay you, say, 120. It's a manner of making the investment more enticing, more attractive to shareholders. Companies Act is very strict about the redemption of preference shares. Preference shares may only be redeemed out of two sources. So the money that is used to redeem these shares can only come out of two sources, namely the proceeds of a fresh issue of shares. So if company needs to now redeem its preference shares, at the same time or just prior to that, it must issue more shares, new shares, so that the money that shareholders pay for the new shares is paid out to the old shareholders. Or alternatively, out of the divisible profits that have been made that could have been used for paying dividends. Now they will not pay dividends, but they will use that money to pay the holders of redeemable preference shares. Okay, there's just that warning there for you to remember. Distinguish between the redemption of preference shares. Don't refer to buying back of preference shares. Redemption of preference shares and the procedure laid down in Section 89 of the Companies Act that we're going to be doing in Unit 14, the company buying back its own shares. Don't stress about the distinction now. We'll do that in Unit 14. Question time? Any questions? Sean?
No questions from my side.
Sydney, are you with me?
No, not any questions thus far.
Okay. Please, people, interrupt me if I'm going too fast or I need to repeat or whatever. I don't want to lose you here. Nathan, are you still with me?
I'm with you, ma'am.
Okay, lovely. Okay, so those are redeemable, those are preference shares. Just to summarize quickly, preference shares are normally cumulative. Their dividends accumulate. They stand first in the queue when it comes to receiving their dividends. Their dividends aren't declared in a particular year, they accumulate. Preference shareholders don't normally have voting rights, except if their dividends are in arrears. Please be careful here. It's the dividends that are in arrears. Don't tell me the shares are in arrears. Shares cannot be in arrears. It's the dividends that are in arrears. Just want to look at something quickly. Okay, so those are preference shares. I don't have slides here. Ordinary shares are literally just that. They are ordinary. They have the right to receive dividends, but they have to wait until the preference dividends have been declared. Then the third class that I mentioned over there, deferred shares, they stand third in the queue. So they will only receive dividends if all the dividends that are owed to preference shareholders and ordinary shareholders have been paid. Only then will they get their dividends. Company must always have ordinary shares. Doesn't have to have preference shares, doesn't have to have deferred shares, but a company cannot exist without ordinary shares. Now, these class rights, explain to you, it's a bunch of flowers. Every flower representing a different right. These class rights can be changed. Changing class rights, known as the variation of class rights, If you use the term changing class rights, that's also fine. I don't mind. Should the company decide, for whatever reason, to change the rights of a particular class, so that's the bunch of flowers that has particular flowers in it, and now it wants to take one flower out and put a different flower in, it is no longer the same, the same bunch of flowers. The class rights have changed. This can be done, but only if 3/4 of the shareholders of that particular class have agreed or given their permission in writing, or alternatively, by way of a special resolution passed at a separate meeting of that particular class. What a special resolution is, just remember it, keep it in the back of your heads. Going to get to that at Unit 8. So that takes us back to this bit. When may preference shareholders vote? When their dividends are in arrears, I've explained that, or when this decision, that resolution that they're voting about directly affects their class rights or interests, then they have the right to vote. Now, it is important that you understand the concept of the variation of class rights. Why is it important? Not because I'm going to ask you for 5 marks to discuss variation of class rights, but you need to understand when will a decision affect the class rights of a particular class. Because when we get to Unit 8, when we talk about general meetings and voting and who may vote and who may not vote, you need to decide. I will tell you what they're voting about, what the topic of the content of the resolution is. And you need to decide, must the preference shareholders vote? Or does this decision not affect their class rights, so they have no voting rights? Class rights are only changed, class rights are only varied if the rights, the flowers in that bunch, differ in substance from what they have been before. If they remain in substance, they still have the same rights, but their shares are less valuable commercially. The value of the shares, they can't resell them for as much. On the open market, they're going to get less for them. That is not a variation of class rights. Your resale value of your shares is not a right. What is a right is the percentage of dividends that you receive, or the number of votes that you have at a meeting, that type of thing. Those are rights. Class rights are varied only if the rights differ in substance from what they have been before, but not if it is only their market value which is affected. Another way of distinguishing, of determining whether class rights have been varied or not, is to look at the nature of the decision. Does the decision affect only a particular class of shares. If it affects only a particular class of shares, then it is a class right. But if it affects the entire company, so all the shares, irrespective of the class, are going to be less valuable, then it is not a class right. So make a note of this. I won't assess you on this directly. I'm not going to ask you to discuss it, but you have to develop a feeling, so to speak, for whether class rights are being affected or not. So how do you become a shareholder? Acquisition of shares. There are two ways in which you can become a shareholder, either directly from the company, which is referred to as the allotment and issue of shares. So the company has unissued shares, part of its authorized share capital as indicated in the memorandum, but it hasn't been issued yet. So those shares don't exist yet. They're only literally a notation in the memorandum. Now you want to acquire shares directly from the company. You apply to the company. The company will allot a particular number of shares to you. You pay for them. Once you have paid for them, they are issued. Now they come into existence and you become a shareholder. Alternatively, you can buy shares from an existing shareholders. So these are shares that have been previously issued. So they are existing shares. Acquiring shares from an existing shareholder has got nothing to do with the company. They can't determine the price or anything, or the reason or whatever. And they may be given away for free. The company may not issue shares for free. However, if I want to give my shares to Nathan, I'm allowed to do that. That is a contract between me and Nathan. So we enter into an agreement that he will obtain my shares, and those shares are then transferred to him. So those are the two manners in which you can acquire shares, either directly from the company by way of allotment of issue, or from an existing shareholder, existing shares, which are then transferred to you. So what is membership of a company? You might have heard, and I think I've mentioned this in previous lectures, that I use the terms membership and shareholding, member, shareholder, interchangeably. Sometimes I'll refer to the members, sometimes I'll refer to the shareholders. In most instances, membership and shareholding is exactly the same. You cannot be a shareholder of a company without also being a member. Now listen to me carefully. You cannot be a shareholder of a company if you are not also a member. So all shareholders are members. I'm going to put this here in the chat box.
Sorry, ma'am.
Yes.
I have a question. With regards to the acquisition of shares, you mentioned that I can buy shares from you. So, and now you're saying here again that in order for you to be a shareholder, you need to be a member of the company. I'm getting confused. Okay, I understand the first part, but then I'm getting confused with the second part that you said.
Okay, maybe you didn't quite understand me. I didn't say in order to be a shareholder, you must be a member in the sense that you must be a member first and then become a shareholder. When you become a shareholder, you also become a member. So if I'm a shareholder and you buy my shares from me, I transfer my shares to you. You become a shareholder and a member. And I stop being a shareholder and I stop being a member. I cannot be a member of a company with a share capital without having shares. Is it clearer now?
Yes, it's clear, ma'am.
Yeah. So I didn't mean to say that you must first be a member in order to buy shares. Didn't mean for it to come out that way. When you become a shareholder, you automatically also become a member. So you cannot become a member without, in a company with a share capital, cannot become a member without also becoming a shareholder. But now I'm making the statement here in the chat box that all shareholders are members. All shareholders are members, but not all members are shareholders. Why am I saying that? And I'm going to ask you this in your first test. All shareholders are members, but not all members are shareholders. This relates to the different types of companies. Think about that. In a
Guys, is it just my sound that's gone?
Mine can't hear.
No.
Mine is.
Mrs. Muted.
Okay, I muted my mic for some very, very strange reason. Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Yes,
Sorry.
ma'am.
Yeah, sorry, for some odd reason, I muted my own mic. That wasn't very clever of me. Okay, let's go back. Let's go back to what I was saying here. I said that all shareholders are members, but not all members are shareholders. And I'm going to ask you in your first test to discuss or to explain this. What do I mean? In a company with a shareholding, you cannot be a shareholder without also being a member. You cannot be a member without also being a shareholder. But there are two types of companies. What is the other type of main type of company? Come, people, come. You cannot forget This is this is integral to you passing company law. You cannot forget what I taught you in Unit 3 by the time we get to Unit 5. Because these units are so closely interwoven. You need to carry this information with you. You have to understand every single unit. There are two main types of company. A company with a shareholding. Yes, Ms. Amaya, you've got your hand up.
Company shareholders and company shareholders.
Okay. Yeah, I see somebody has put it here in the chat box as well. Two main types of companies. A company with a shareholding and a company without a shareholding, also known as a company limited by guarantee. As Ms. van der Westhuizen has put here, a non-shareholding company. I'll also accept that terminology. Now, a company limited by guarantee does not issue shares. It is a company without a shareholding. So you cannot ever be a shareholder of a company limited by guarantee because there aren't any shares for you to hold. So in a company limited by guarantee,
Muted again.
Ma'am, your sound is gone again. I think you clicked mute all participants. That will mute you as well.
I don't know. This is very, okay. Yeah, I see it's just gone off again. I'm in the chat box. I'm not in the where I can mute myself. Wondering if somebody else isn't interfering, hasn't like taken over presenters' rights here or something. But never mind. When did I go off? What was I saying? That all shareholders are members, because you cannot be a shareholder without being a member. But not all members are shareholders, because you get companies that don't have a shareholding, that don't have shareholders, they only have members. Is everybody with me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am, I think so.
Okay, so how do you become a member of a company? You become a member of a company in one of two ways. The very first members subscribe to the Memorandum of Association. So the first members of a company become members by literally signing the Memorandum of Association. After that, because I've stressed this before, that only the founding members sign the Memorandum of Association. Anybody that becomes a member of a company after that becomes a member merely by agreeing to become a member of the company and having their name entered in the register of members. Be careful here, once again. Two possible test questions that I can ask you. I can ask you, how do you acquire shares? And I can ask you, how do you become a member? Read your question carefully. Don't confuse the two. Okay, and then the very last bit, the last section of this unit refers to debentures. Sure, you've heard the word debenture as well. A debenture is another way in which you can invest money in a company, is by buying a debenture. A debenture is merely a fancy company law term for an IOU. You lend money to the company, they issue a debenture to you, which will state how much interest you're going to get, and yes, basically how much interest you will earn on your debenture. Important for you to understand, this is another potential test question, the differences between debentures and shareholders. Debenture holders and shareholders. Shareholders own the company. Debenture holders are merely creditors. They have just lent money to the company. Shareholders can vote. They have voting rights. Debenture holders don't have voting rights because they are not shareholders. They are not owners. They don't vote. Shareholders get dividends when these dividends have been declared. Debenture holders, when you buy debentures, you enter into an agreement with the company that you will receive a certain amount of interest at a fixed rate at a certain time, every 6 months, once a year, whatever, 5% on the amount due, etc., etc. So that's fixed, that's guaranteed. Dividends depends on the directors. When the company is wound up, your shareholders will share in the surplus, the amount that is left after the debts have been paid. Debenture holders, however, do not share in the surplus. Okay, and that's the entire unit. There was an earlier question here from Arunisia. How are dividends paid, percentage or what? There are different manners, and that will be determined in the constitution, in the articles of a company, but it's normally something in the line of that preference shareholders will get 10% of all dividends declared, etc., etc. Otherwise, if you don't have preference shareholders, it is divided equally amongst the value, the par value, not the market value, but the par value of your shares. So if Alicia holds 50% owns 50% of the shares calculated in terms of their par value, she will get 50% of the money available for dividends. So that can vary, but yes, Arunisha, it is normally based on percentages. The amount of money to be used for the payment of dividends is not a legal issue. That is a management issue. That is a decision that the directors of a company will make based on the overall profitability, etc., of a company within a particular financial period. Further questions?
Good evening, Miss.
Yes, Ms. Kamati?
Sorry, it's not related to the class. I sent you an email to add me on e-learning and MS Teams yesterday.
I've been tied up in interviews for new staff members the past 2 days. I will still get through to all my emails. So just bear with me. I think I sort of saw it vaguely, but I haven't had the opportunity to do it yet. But in the course of the week, I will sit down and work through all my backlog of emails.
All right. Thank you, Miss.
Okay, further questions?
No questions from me, ma'am.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you also, Alicia, for your sensible advice and guidance that you always give on the group to help out the lost souls. Saves me a lot of effort in replying, because somebody asked a question and Alicia has already answered them. So I don't have to. It's noticed and appreciated. Okay, that's it for tonight then. Thank you very, very, very much. I will see you then on Thursday.
Thank you, ma'am. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you, Mom.
Bye, Miss.
Bye.